The sharp scent of bleach and stale cigarettes hit Melanie Thompson's nose as her eyes fluttered open. Her head pounded, and her mouth was dry. She struggled to focus, trying to make sense of her surroundings. The unfamiliar, dingy motel room felt suffocating, the thick floral curtains blocking out the morning light. She blinked hard, her mind struggling to catch up with reality. As Melanie shifted on the stiff mattress, she felt something cold against her hand. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned to the side. The blood drained from her face. Lying next to her, motionless, was the body of a man, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. His throat was slashed, the sheets beneath him soaked in dark, drying blood. Melanie screamed, scrambling out of the bed and backing into the corner of the room. Her heart raced, and panic seized her chest. Who was this man? How had she ended up here? She tried to recall the events from the night before, but her mind was a blur. Flashes of a bar, laughter, and the clink of glasses surfaced, but nothing concrete. Her memory felt like a fog she couldn't penetrate. She pressed her trembling hands to her forehead, her breathing shallow and rapid. She had to get out of here. But as she reached for her phone on the nightstand, the harsh knock on the door made her freeze. Then, a voice of firm, commanding voice called from outside. "Police, open up." Melanie's heart plummeted. Her hand hovered over the door handle. She wasn't ready for what was about to happen. The police didn't take long to turn the motel room into a crime scene. Yellow tape crisscrossed the door as officers and forensic technicians shuffled in and out, documenting every inch. Melanie sat on the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around her body as if trying to protect herself from the nightmare unfolding around her. Two detectives stood nearby, their eyes on her as they spoke in hushed tones. Detective Roy Jacobs, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a hard, unforgiving face, was the first to approach her. His partner, Detective Olivia Marks, younger and sharper, lingered behind, observing. "Miss Thompson," Jacobs began, his tone flat, "you want to explain how you ended up in this room with a dead man?" Melanie shook her head, her throat dry. I don't know. I don't remember." Jacobs raised an eyebrow. "Convenient," he muttered. "His name's Jason Rivers. Does that ring any bells?" Melanie stared at the floor. The name meant nothing to her. How could she not know the man lying dead beside her? The detectives exchanged a glance, clearly skeptical of her story. "Miss Thompson, you were found at the scene of a murder. There are no signs of forced entry. And according to the motel's security footage, you were the only person who entered this room with Mr. Rivers last night," Marks added, her voice calm but piercing. "I didn't kill him," Melanie whispered, her voice barely audible. But even to her own ears, it sounded weak, unconvincing. Marks crouched down to her level, locking eyes with her. "If you didn't kill him, then who did, and why?" Melanie shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I don't know. I don't remember anything. I was at a bar, and then it all goes blank." Jacob straightened up, looking unimpressed. "You're either hiding something, or you're in deep trouble. Either way, you're our prime suspect until we find out otherwise." The words hung heavy in the air. Melanie felt a wave of helplessness crash over her, but deep inside, a flicker of something else emerged. Determination. If the police weren't going to believe her, she'd have to figure this out on her own. Someone had set her up, and she was going to find out who. Melanie sat in the back of the squad car, the weight of everything pressing down on her like a lead blanket. After hours of questioning, the police had finally let her go for now pending further investigation. They had her fingerprints, her statement, and her promise not to leave town. But that wouldn't help her. She needed answers, and the fragments of her memory from the previous night weren't giving her any. Back at her tiny apartment, Melanie collapsed onto her couch, her head still throbbing from the stress and shock. She closed her eyes and tried to piece together what she could remember. The bar had been loud, packed with bodies moving to the beat of music that now felt distant. She had been with someone, she was sure of it. A man? Yes, but not Jason Rivers. Someone else. She could almost see his face. But every time she tried to focus, it slipped away like water through her fingers. She cursed under her breath. There had to be a way to pull those memories to the surface. She grabbed her phone and began scrolling through her contacts, looking for a familiar name, anyone she might have been with. Then she saw it, Allison. Her best friend, the one person she could count on, and the one person who might remember details she had forgotten. She hit call, her leg bouncing nervously as the phone rang. When Allison picked up, her voice was groggy, like she'd just woken up. "Mel? What's going on? You sound weird." "Allie, I need your help," Melanie stammered, her voice trembling. "Do you remember last night? We were at that bar. Do you remember who I was with?" Allison paused for a moment before answering. "Yeah, you were talking to some guy. Tall, dark hair, wearing a leather jacket. You two seemed pretty into each other. You left together, I think." Melanie's stomach dropped. "What about Jason Rivers? Do you remember him?" There was silence on the other end, followed by a confused, "Who the hell is Jason Rivers?" That was it. The name meant nothing to Allison either. Melanie ended the call, her heart racing. Whoever this man was, he hadn't been the one she was with last night. Someone else had to be involved. And if she could just find out who that man in the leather jacket was, she might be one step closer to the truth. The next morning, Melanie knew she couldn't stay idle. She needed to retrace her steps and figure out who the man from the bar was. If anyone had seen them together or remembered anything unusual, it could lead her to the person who had framed her. She started by heading back to Lucky's Tavern, the dimly lit bar where everything had started. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the clouds as she walked through the door, the smell of stale beer still clinging to the air despite the early hour. The bartender, a gruff older man who seemed to live behind the bar, was wiping down glasses. He glanced up as she approached, his brow furrowed. "You were here last night," he said, more of a statement than a question. "You and that guy?" Melanie's pulse quickened. "The guy I was with, do you remember him?" He was wearing a leather jacket. Dark hair. The bartender nodded slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, I remember him. Didn't seem like a local. Kept to himself until you two started talking. Then he bought you a couple drinks." Melanie leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Do you know his name? Or did you see where he went?" The bartender shrugged. "No name. But he paid with a credit card. It gave me a weird feeling, though. Left in a hurry when you two walked out together." Melanie's stomach churned. Whoever this man was, he had vanished without a trace after she'd left with him. He was her only lead, and he was slipping through her fingers. "Can you check the name on the credit card?" she asked, her voice tight with desperation. "Please. It's important." The bartender eyed her for a moment, his expression skeptical. Then, with a grunt, he turned to the register and punched in a few buttons. After a moment, he pulled out the transaction receipt and glanced at it. "Name's Carter." "Carter Lane," he said, handing her the slip. Melanie stared at the name, her pulse quickening again. She didn't know a Carter Lane, but at least now she had a name, a real lead. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place, though the picture they formed was still blurry. Someone had orchestrated this, someone had killed Jason Rivers and left her to take the fall, and now she had to find Carter Lane before it was too late. Armed with the name Carter Lane, Melanie left the bar, her mind racing. She still had no memory of what had happened after leaving with him, but if he was the one she'd been with, he had to know more about what went down that night. The police were still treating her as their prime suspect, and every hour that passed without answers made things worse. She had no choice but to find him. Back at her apartment, she pulled out her laptop and started searching. The name Carter Lane was surprisingly common. Pages and pages of results filled the screen. Frustration clawed at her. She narrowed the search to their city, but still, nothing. She clicked through the pages until one result caught her eye. A social media profile of a man who matched the description Allison had given her. Dark hair, leather jacket. It was him. Her heart pounded as she clicked the profile open. His posts were sparse, mostly photos of him at bars or hanging out in shadowy, half-lit rooms. He didn't seem to have many friends, at least not online. His most recent post was from 2 days ago, just before the night that had landed her in this mess. The post didn't say much, just a location tag: Pete's Garage, an old bar on the other side of town, known for attracting a rough crowd. Melanie stared at the screen, debating her next move. She knew going to the bar was risky. What if Carter wasn't there? Worse, what if he was and knew she was onto him? But she couldn't just sit and wait for the police to find more evidence pointing at her. She had to be proactive. Taking a deep breath, she grabbed her jacket and headed for the door. Pete's Garage was even seedier than she had imagined. The dim lighting barely illuminated the grimy walls, and the low hum of conversation buzzed in the background as Melanie walked in. The patrons looked rough around the edges: tattoos, leather jackets, and cigarette smoke swirling in the air. She hesitated at the entrance, scanning the room for any sign of Carter. Then she saw him. He was sitting at a corner table, nursing a drink, his face partially hidden in the shadows. The sight of him sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She knew she had to approach him, but fear gripped her. What if he ran? What if he was dangerous? Summoning her courage, she walked over to his table. Carter glanced up, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them said a word. "You?" Melanie finally said, her voice tight. "I need to talk to you." Carter didn't look surprised, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but guarded. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he said, his voice low. Melanie's pulse quickened. "You know who I am." Carter smiled, but it wasn't warm. "You could say that. Sit down." She hesitated but sat across from him, keeping her distance. The tension between them was thick, and she could feel her palms sweating. "What happened that night?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. "You and I left the bar together, but I don't remember anything after that. I woke up next to a dead man, and now the police think I killed him. What the hell happened?" Carter swirled his drink, studying her for a moment. "I didn't kill anyone, if that's what you're getting at." Melanie leaned forward, her frustration mounting. "Then who did? Why was I there, in that motel, with Jason Rivers? What aren't you telling me? Carter set his glass down and leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. I don't know what happened after we left, Melanie. We had a few drinks, talked, and yeah, we left together. But you weren't acting like yourself. Someone slipped something in your drink. Melanie's blood ran cold. What? You were starting to fade, barely able to walk straight. I didn't know what to do, so I left you in a cab. I thought you'd be safe. I didn't know where you ended up, and I sure as hell didn't follow you to that motel. Her heart raced. If someone had drugged her, it would explain the blank spots in her memory, but it raised even more questions. Who drugged me? Carter shook his head. I don't know. I didn't see anything, but I noticed you were out of it by the time we were leaving. Melanie's mind raced. If Carter was telling the truth, then she hadn't killed Jason Rivers, but someone had deliberately incapacitated her and led her into that motel room. This wasn't just a random murder. It was a setup. She stood abruptly, feeling the weight of the room closing in on her. You have to go to the police. Tell them what you told me. Carter's expression hardened. I'm not getting involved. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but I don't need cops sniffing around my life. I've got enough problems of my own. Melanie glared at him, anger bubbling inside her. So, you're just going to let me take the fall for this? Carter didn't flinch. I told you what I know. That's all you're getting from me. You want answers. Find out who wanted you out of the picture. His words hung in the air like a dark cloud. As Melanie stormed out of the bar, she realized that she was now deeper into the mystery than ever. Someone had set her up, and Carter's indifference meant she was on her own. She had to figure out who was behind this before it was too late. As Melanie left Pete's garage, the chill of the night air hit her, cutting through the fog of fear and confusion clouding her mind. Carter Lane had been no help worse. He'd left her feeling even more vulnerable. If someone had slipped something into her drink, they'd been planning this for longer than she realized. But who? And why? She started walking, the city streets quieter now, shadows creeping into every corner. The thought of being followed made her skin crawl. She glanced over her shoulder every few steps, convinced someone was watching her. Maybe the police. Maybe the real killer. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she jumped, her nerves on edge. It was Allison, likely wondering where she was. Mel? You okay? I've been worried. Sick. Allison's voice was a mix of panic and concern. I'm fine, Melanie lied, her voice unsteady. But things are worse than I thought. Carter told me someone drugged me at the bar. I don't know who, but... Wait, Allison interrupted. Carter? And the guy from last night? You found him? I did, but he's not helping. He just confirmed that I was out of it when we left the bar. Melanie sighed, glancing around nervously as she spoke. Allie, I need your help. Can you think of anyone at all who would want to frame me for this? There was silence on the other end, followed by a hesitant voice. I don't know, Mel. This is insane. I mean, you've never done anything to anyone, right? Melanie bit her lip. Thinking back over the last few months, there was no one she could think of who had a grudge against her. She was just a regular person, no enemies, no debts, no drama. But the image of Jason Rivers' lifeless body flashed in her mind, and she shuddered. She had no idea who he even was, and yet she was now caught in the middle of his murder. Allie, if someone's framing me, they must have had this planned. This wasn't random. Can you meet me tomorrow? I need to retrace everything, figure out who was at the bar and who might have been watching me. Of course, Allison said, her voice shaky but resolute. I'll help you, whatever it takes. Just be careful, okay? Whoever did this, they're dangerous. I will. Thanks, Allie. Hanging up, Melanie felt a small surge of relief knowing she wasn't completely alone. But the truth was, she had no idea how deep this went, or who she could really trust. And as she walked back toward her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The next morning, Melanie woke early, her mind still racing from the previous night's revelations. She had barely slept, haunted by dreams of blood-stained sheets in the cold, dead eyes of Jason Rivers staring at her. Now, as the sunlight crept through the blinds, she knew she had to act fast. She met Allison at a small cafe downtown, the same place they'd gone 100 times before. But today, the familiar setting felt foreign, like she didn't belong there anymore. The weight of the murder clung to her like a shadow. Allison arrived, looking tired but determined. She slid into the booth across from Melanie and leaned in, her voice low. I did some digging last night, she said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. I looked up Jason Rivers. He wasn't just some random guy. Melanie's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He worked for some big real estate developer, Holt Enterprises, Allison continued, pulling out her phone and showing Melanie a news article. There's been all this controversy around them lately, something about illegal land deals, shady business practices. Melanie stared at the article, her mind spinning. Why would I end up involved with someone like him? I've never heard of Holt Enterprises. I don't know, Allison admitted. But there's more. I checked the police blotter, and Rivers was already on their radar. He was supposed to meet with investigators about some whistleblowing thing. They were going to ask him about some dirty deals he'd uncovered. Melanie's stomach churned. You think someone had him killed because of that? And I was just, what? The patsy. Allison's face grew grim. That's what it sounds like. Someone wanted him out of the picture, and they found a perfect scapegoat in you. Melanie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. But why me? Why not someone else? I don't know, Allison said, her voice barely above a whisper. But whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They drugged you, made sure you were at the scene of the crime, and left you to take the fall. This was planned, Mel. And if Rivers was onto something dangerous, it means the people behind this are powerful. Melanie leaned back, the weight of it all crashing down on her. She wasn't just dealing with a random murder. She had been pulled into something far more sinister, a conspiracy that could destroy her life. Allie, if this is as big as it seems, I don't think we're safe, Melanie said, her voice shaking. Allison nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We need to figure out who else was involved, Mel, before they come for you again. The gravity of Allison's words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Melanie gripped the edge of the table, her mind racing. If Jason Rivers had been killed because of what he knew, and she was being framed for his murder, then whoever was behind this had more at stake than just eliminating him. They wanted to silence anyone who got too close, and Melanie had unknowingly walked right into their trap. We have to be smart about this, Allison said, her voice trembling. We can't just go digging around and hope they won't notice. If they framed you, they're watching you. Melanie's throat tightened. The thought of being constantly under surveillance made her skin crawl. So what do we do? I can't sit around waiting for them to finish what they started. Allison nodded, her expression resolute. First, we figure out who else Jason was working with. Someone at Holt Enterprises, or maybe even the police. There's no way he was investigating all this alone. Melanie leaned in, her eyes flicking toward the windows as if expecting to see someone lurking outside. How do we even start? The police already think I'm guilty, and I can't exactly walk into Holt Enterprises asking questions. Allison tapped her phone nervously against the table. I know someone. Well, sort of. A journalist. He's been reporting on Holt Enterprises for months, digging up dirt on their shady deals. If anyone knows more about what Jason was into, it's him. Will he talk to us? Allison hesitated, then nodded. He's not the most friendly guy, but he might listen if we tell him what's going on. His name is Greg Sanders. He writes for the Sentinel. Melanie felt a spark of hope. This was her first real chance at getting to the bottom of things. If Greg Sanders had been tracking Holt Enterprises, maybe he could connect the dots that she couldn't see yet. But it was also a huge risk. If this conspiracy was as deep as it seemed, involving someone like a journalist could make her jealous, could make her an even bigger target. All right, she said, her voice firm. Let's meet him. But we have to be careful. Later that afternoon, they met Greg Sanders at a rundown diner on the outskirts of town. He was a grizzled man in his late 40s, with a permanent scowl etched into his face and eyes that seemed to pierce right through Melanie. He didn't say much as they sat down, just folded his arms and stared at them, waiting for them to speak. You wanted information on Holt Enterprises, Greg said finally, his tone gruff. I've been after them for months. Got enough dirt on them to fill a landfill, but they're slippery. What makes you two so interested? Melanie exchanged a glance with Allison before speaking. I was framed for the murder of Jason Rivers. He was investigating Holt Enterprises, right? Greg's eyes narrowed. Rivers was supposed to be my source. He was going to hand over documents that proved everything: money laundering, backdoor deals, blackmail. But then, just like that, he's dead. And now you're telling me you're tied up in this. Melanie nodded, feeling the weight of Greg's intense gaze. I don't know why they chose me, but I woke up next to his body, and the police think I killed him. Someone drugged me at the bar, and I can't remember anything. I need to know what Jason was working on. Greg leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the table rhythmically. Holt Enterprises is dirty, but they're careful. They've got their hands in all the right pockets. Cops, politicians, even local business owners. Rivers was going to blow the whistle on something big, but I never got to see what. If someone set you up, it means you're not just a scapegoat, you're a loose end. And loose ends don't last long. A chill ran down Melanie's spine. The cold truth of his words hit her hard. Whoever had done this wouldn't stop until she was out of the picture completely. What about the documents Jason was going to give you? Allison asked, her voice hopeful. Is there any way to find them? Greg's lips tightened. He didn't trust digital files, thought they were too easy to trace. He kept everything in physical form: paper, hard drives, you name it. But when I went looking for him after he missed our meeting, his apartment had already been cleaned out. Whoever killed him made sure there was no trail. Melanie felt the small flicker of hope extinguish. So, there's nothing. Greg studied her, his eyes narrowing. There's one place I haven't checked yet. Jason had a storage unit across town. If he didn't have time to hand me the evidence, maybe he stashed it there. Her heart raced. This could be the break she needed. Can you take us there? Greg's expression darkened. It's risky. If Holt's people are watching, they might have eyes on that unit. But if you're serious about clearing your name, we don't have much choice. Melanie nodded, feeling a new wave of determination. We have to go. It's the only chance I have. Greg sighed, rubbing his hand across his stubbled jaw. Fine, but we do this smart. We go tonight when the place is quiet. If we're lucky, no one's watching. Hours later, under the cover of darkness, Melanie, Allison, and Greg arrived at a rundown storage facility on the outskirts of the city. The place looked deserted, its long rows of rusted metal doors eerily silent. Melanie's heart pounded as they walked down the dimly lit aisles, the weight of every shadow pressing down on her. Greg led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. It's here, he said, stopping in front of a unit near the back. The lock was heavy, but Greg pulled out a small set of tools, working quickly to pop it open. The door creaked as it rolled up, revealing a small, cramped space filled with boxes, papers, and old electronics. Dust clung to everything, the air thick and stale. Melanie and Allison stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room for anything that might help. There, Greg said, pointing to a stack of folders in the corner. That's what we're looking for. Melanie hurried over, her hands trembling as she picked up the first folder. It was filled with papers, financial records, contracts, and notes scribbled in Jason's handwriting. She flipped through them, her eyes widening as she realized the scope of what Jason had uncovered. This is it, she whispered. This proves everything. But before she could fully process what she was holding, a noise from outside made them all freeze. The sound of a car door slamming echoed through the storage facility. Greg's eyes darkened. We've got company. The sound of the car door slamming outside sent a shockwave of fear through Melanie. Her hands, still clutching the incriminating documents, began to shake. Allison stood frozen, wide-eyed, while Greg's face hardened into a grim mask. He stepped toward the entrance of the storage unit, peering cautiously through the crack between the door and the frame. We have to get out of here, Greg whispered, his voice urgent. If they're here, they're not here for a chat. Melanie's pulse quickened. Do you think they followed us, she asked, her voice barely audible. Greg frowned. Could be. They've got eyes everywhere. Or they might have just been watching the unit, waiting for someone like us to show up. The documents in her hands were the key to everything. Jason's proof that Holt Enterprises had been engaged in massive corruption. But now, holding them in her trembling hands felt like a death sentence. If they were caught with this evidence, it wouldn't be a simple arrest. Whoever was behind this murder wasn't interested in letting anyone live to tell the tale. Take what you can carry, Greg ordered, pulling a small camera from his bag. We can't haul all these files, but if we can photograph the key documents, we'll have enough. Allison snapped into action, helping Melanie quickly sift through the folders, pulling out pages that looked the most important ledgers showing bribes, emails linking top executives to shady land deals, photos of properties that didn't officially exist. All of it was damning. The hum of an approaching car engine reverberated through the storage facility, making the metal walls vibrate. The headlights swept across the row, illuminating the entrance to the unit. Greg cursed under his breath. We're out of time, he said through gritted teeth, stuffing the camera into his jacket. We have to go. Now. Melanie grabbed the last of the documents, shoving them into her bag. Just as she zipped it up, heavy footsteps echoed outside, followed by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Stay calm, Greg whispered. Follow my lead. He motioned for them to step back into the shadows of the storage unit as he carefully slid the door down, leaving just a sliver open for them to peek through. Outside, two men in dark suits emerged from the car, their movements precise and calculated. One of them, a hulking figure with a shaved head, held a gun at his side, while the other, a lean man in sunglasses, scanned the row of storage units with a sharp, predatory gaze. Melanie's heart pounded in her chest. These weren't just hired thugs. These men were professionals, killers sent to clean up a loose end. We split up, Greg whispered. You two head for the fence at the back. There's a small gap, it's your best shot. I'll draw them away. Melanie's stomach dropped. Greg, no, you can't. Don't. I'm not asking, Greg cut her off, his voice steely. You get out of here. Take the evidence and run. Before either of them could protest, Greg slipped out through the gap in the door, disappearing into the shadows. Melanie clutched Allison's arm, her pulse racing as they heard the sound of footsteps moving toward the front of the storage unit. He's trying to buy us time, Melanie whispered, her voice shaky. Allison nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. We can't let him do this for nothing. The two women edged toward the back of the unit, where Greg had said there was a gap in the fence. Outside, they could hear the men's voices, low and threatening, as they moved through the rows of storage units, searching. Over here. The door's been opened, one of the men barked, his voice cold. Melanie's breath caught in her throat. They didn't have much time. She and Allison reached the back of the unit, slipping through the narrow opening and into the cold night air. The storage facility was backed by an overgrown field, and beyond that, the city's industrial district loomed in the distance. There, Allison pointed, spotting the small gap in the chain-link fence. They rushed toward it, moving as quickly and quietly as they could. But behind them, the sound of boots on gravel was growing louder. They crouched down, squeezing through the gap in the fence one at a time. Melanie went first, her bag snagging on the jagged wire. She tugged it free just as Allison slipped through behind her, the fence rattling as it closed. They stumbled into the field, breathless, with the sound of footsteps now alarmingly close. They ran. The tall grass whipped at their legs as they sprinted toward the darkened edge of the industrial complex. The shadows offered some protection, but the pounding of their hearts in their ears made it hard to focus. Behind them, a gunshot cracked through the night, and Melanie's heart leapt into her throat. "They saw us," Allison gasped, her voice shaking with fear. Melanie glanced over her shoulder, spotting the two men vaulting the fence. They were closing in fast, their footsteps heavy, and the glow of a flashlight cut through the darkness. "We have to hide," Melanie panted. "We'll never outrun them." Ahead, the hulking silhouette of a warehouse loomed in the distance. Its windows were boarded up, the walls covered in rust and graffiti. It looked abandoned, but it was their only option. Grabbing Allison's hand, Melanie dragged her toward it, praying the doors weren't locked. They reached the warehouse and darted around the side, pressing themselves flat against the wall as the men's voices echoed through the field behind them. "This way." "I saw them run toward the buildings," one of the men yelled. Melanie's pulse pounded in her ears. She spotted a side door, partially obscured by a pile of scrap metal. She yanked on the rusted handle, and to her relief, it gave way. The door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. Once inside, the darkness swallowed them whole. They crouched low, their breaths ragged, trying to stay silent. The distant sound of the men's boots grew fainter, but they knew it wasn't over. These men wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted or until Melanie and Allison were dead. "Do you think Greg made it?" Allison whispered, her voice trembling. Melanie didn't answer. She didn't want to think about what might have happened to Greg. All she knew was that the evidence now in her bag might be the only thing that could save her life. And the killers were still out there, hunting her down. The cold, musty air inside the abandoned warehouse pressed against Melanie's skin, each breath feeling heavier than the last. She and Allison crouched in the darkness, their backs pressed against the decaying walls, listening for any signs of their pursuers. The distant crunch of gravel and the muffled voices outside were enough to keep their fear at a peak. Allison clutched Melanie's arm, her fingers digging in. "What if they find us in here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Melanie didn't respond. Her mind raced, replaying Greg's sacrifice and their harrowing escape from the storage unit. She couldn't afford to let fear paralyze her. The evidence, Jason Rivers' documents, was still in her bag, proof of everything, but it might as well have been a target on her back. Whoever was after them knew how to track, how to kill. "They'll search the buildings," Melanie finally whispered, her voice tight. "We need to find another way out." They crept deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps nearly silent on the cracked concrete floor. The building was massive, a labyrinth of rusted machinery and forgotten equipment, with shafts of moonlight streaming in through broken windows high above. The silence inside felt like it was pushing down on them, but outside, the killers were closing in. As they moved through the shadows, Melanie's mind replayed Greg's words: Holt Enterprises, dirty deals, corruption. Jason had known too much, and now it seemed Holt's men were determined to erase any trace of his investigation, and that included Melanie. They weren't just hunting her. They were trying to destroy the evidence she carried. They passed a series of rusted conveyor belts and piles of decaying wood, heading toward what looked like an office at the far end of the warehouse. The air smelled of rust and mildew, but it was quiet, a momentary refuge. "We can hide in here," Melanie said, pushing open the office door. Inside, the small room was cluttered with old filing cabinets and broken desks, dust thick in the air, at least until we figure out what to do next. Allison nodded, but her face was pale, her nerves frayed. "Do you think Greg got away?" Melanie's chest tightened. Greg had risked everything to help them, and she didn't even know if he'd survived. "I don't know. But we can't wait around. We need to." Suddenly, the faint echo of footsteps outside the office door made them freeze. Melanie's heart lurched in her chest. The killers were inside the warehouse. "We saw them come in here," a voice called out, sharp and cold. Panic surged through Melanie. The men were closer than she had thought. They had to move, and fast. "Allie," Melanie whispered, grabbing her friend's arm. "We need to go, now." They slipped out the back of the office, moving through the narrow, cluttered corridors that crisscrossed the warehouse. The walls felt like they were closing in, every noise amplifying their terror. They could hear the men's voices getting louder, the beams of flashlights bouncing off the rusted walls. "There's got to be another way out," Allison whispered, her voice trembling. Melanie's mind was racing, scanning the dark corners for an exit. Then she saw a small hatch in the floor, partially hidden by debris. She rushed over, tugging at the rusted metal cover. It was heavy, and for a moment, she feared it wouldn't budge. But with a grunt, she pried it open, revealing a narrow crawl space beneath. "This way," she whispered, her voice urgent. They crawled into the cramped space, pulling the hatch closed behind them just as the footsteps approached the office. The space was claustrophobic, the air damp and stale, but it offered protection. They crouched low, listening as the men searched the office, their voices sharp and impatient. "They're not here," one of the men muttered, his frustration clear. "Keep looking." Melanie held her breath, her heart hammering in her chest as the footsteps moved away. The silence that followed was deafening, but the danger hadn't passed. They couldn't stay hidden here forever. After what felt like hours, Melanie leaned closer to Allison. "I think they're gone," she whispered. "We need to find another way out before they come back." Allison nodded, though her face was pale with fear. They crawled through the narrow space, moving as quietly as they could. The crawl space eventually led them to a rusted metal grate at the far end of the warehouse. Melanie pressed her ear to the grate, listening for any sounds outside. Silence. They were alone for now. Carefully, she pushed the grate open, and they crawled out into the night air. The warehouse's back lot was overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris, but it was empty. No sign of the men who had been hunting them. "We made it," Allison breathed, her voice shaky. But Melanie's relief was short-lived. They were still being hunted, and whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they had both the evidence in their lives. She clutched the bag tighter. "We need to get to the police," she said, her voice firm. "We have enough proof now." Allison glanced around, her eyes wide with fear. "But what if Holt's people are already watching the cops? What if we walk right into their hands?" Melanie bit her lip, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had no idea who she could trust anymore, but she knew one thing for sure: time was running out. And if they didn't act soon, they wouldn't live to see the truth exposed. Heart still racing. She turned to Allison, who was watching her with anxious eyes. "He's alive. We need to go."